Welcome back, YouTube. Big Rich once again, Northern California, Silicon Valley. Part 2 of my video series on turning the Losi Mini Rally 1/14 scale into a drift vehicle. On this one I'll show you how I locked up the rear diff, starting off by just removing the rear wheels. I'm just storing the nuts on the axles there. And I'm going to do this what some might call the hard way, or I'm going to call the thorough way. I'm going to go ahead and remove all 10 screws off the top plate so I can get the top plate off, and that does involve cutting the zip tie that holds the wires down from the factory. So I actually cut that so I can get access to those center 2 screws, and I'll get the top plate completely removed. I'll have to rebundle the wires when I'm done here. And I'm just kind of making a note of where all the screws came from by putting them in the order that I took them off there on the right. That way when it's time to put it back together, I can get every screw in the same hole that it came out of originally. And the next thing I'm going to do is remove the 2 nuts that hold on the top of the shocks, just to get the shocks loose. I'm not going to actually remove them from the vehicle, but just to get them loose there. And then I'm going to pop off these rod ends here so that I can actually get the rear diff completely off the vehicle, which you could actually leave the bottom case in and still do this, but I'm just gonna, like I said, do it the more thorough way. And I'm just setting the dog bones in my pile to the side there with all the parts that I've removed neatly. That way everything goes back exactly where it came. And I'm taking off this little cover here that holds the drive shaft down and putting it in the right place with the screws and stuff that I'm putting aside. Now I will remove the 4 bolts or screws that hold in the diff from the bottom of the chassis. So there's 4 of them there, and just removing those and putting those screws aside. And there's a little bumper on the rear here that I will remove, and it's held on by 4 screws. In hindsight, I could have just removed the bottom 2 screws, and that would have allowed me to take the rear suspension mount off, and that would have allowed me to get the rear suspension arms off the car. But I went ahead and took all 4 screws out. It's my first time disassembling this car. Really not a lot of work though, so it was pretty easy to do. And now I've got the rear diff assembly, including the rear shock tower, off, and I'll just take off the 6 screws that hold the top cover on the diff, and I'm just going to set those like I've been doing before in order that they came off so I can put them exactly where they were. And so I'm just making a little pile there. And now I've got the top case off, and that exposes the differential, which is what I'm going to lock up. So that's the top case there. And so take note of the way that it's facing. The diff could go in either direction, but you can see here that the gear is on the right, and this is the correct way to install it. If you install it the other way, the wheels will go backwards when you put it back together. Very frustrating. You'll have to take it all apart. So the next step here is I'm going to lay the diff on a clean paper towel and use another clean paper towel to remove all the grease around here, and I'll be re-greasing it when I put it back together, but in order to work on it, I'm going to remove as much grease as I possibly can. I'm even going to use some of my tools to get more grease out. Now I'll open up the diff. There's just 3 screws that hold it in. It's a very small Phillips, so I'll remove these 3 screws and get inside the diff. And you can see there's a lot of grease in there, and I'm going to use a paper towel and clean that up as best I can, and I'll use my tools to get that nice and clean. And there are 3 tiny gears here. I think they're something like spider gears, and I'm going to actually just remove those and set them aside. I'll put them in a Ziploc bag and save them for if I need to unlock the diff, but in this procedure I'm going to completely remove them and not put them back in when I put the diff back together. So that's a key here, is that I'm going to not be reinstalling those 3 gears. You can see what the gears look like there, and they're not going back in the car. So now that I've got most of the grease removed and I've got it as clean as I possibly can, I'm going to heat up the hot glue gun, and a tip here is let that thing get as hot as it gets. It might allow you to glue things when it's not all the way hot, but for what we're doing here today, it must be as hot as it can get, because you really need that hot glue to be liquid, molten. And you can see I've got those gears out, and I'll give you a good shot of it here. So those gears are not going back in. And what I'm going to do is on each half of the diff, I'm going to fill it up with hot glue, and I'm going to, like I said, make sure the glue is nice and hot so it can fall into all the cracks. If there's air in there, eventually the diff can break free and start spinning again, and you'll lose the locked function that we're looking here, the posi. So I've got both halves of the diff here, and I'm going to fill it up with the hot glue. If you make a mistake here, it's no problem. You can just peel the hot glue right off and do it again. I actually ended up doing this 2 or 3 times till I got it right. And what I'm doing is just filling up just the open holes there with the hot glue, and then I'm going to let it settle down. It looks like I'm putting a ton there from the angle, but it's actually not that much, and once it falls in, it gets pretty flush. If you've got too much there, you won't be able to put the diff back together, so you'll probably have to peel it off and do it again. And while it's still in this state here, it's not dry, but it's not completely hot. I can actually push it down a little bit with my hands and get it to the right shape that I need it to. Repeating the exact same procedure for the other side, and once they're exactly how I like them, or let's just say that they're exactly the right way so that I can put the diff assembly back together, I'll push it together really hard. And the key is that there's no air in here. I want it just completely locked. I've done this before with other vehicles, and if there is any air in there, eventually it can get to the point where it breaks free, and then you lose the locked feature, and you've got to do it again. So I've got just the right amount. It's still a little bit soft where I can press it together while I put the diff assembly back together, and then I can get those 3 screws back in there. I've got to put a lot of pressure while I reassemble it, so I wasn't able to get a good angle to show you on camera, but basically I just press it down very hard and then tighten these 3 screws one at a time, just alternating so that it goes together flat. And I've actually already run this car 2 full battery packs, and it stayed locked, so it looks like this method's going to work well on this differential. I've done this on the HPI Sprint 2 Flux, and it's a much bigger diff and much easier to work with, and it only has 1 spider gear. But it seems like this is going to work for this Mini 8 or Kimura style diff. And from here, I'm just going to put it back together in super high speed. Remember, the key is that you put the differential into the diff case in the right orientation, like you see there. The gear goes on the right, and if you do it backwards, you'll have to take it apart because it won't work right. And so I've got it back in the case, and now I'm just going to put the 6 screws back here and do everything the opposite of what I did in order to take it apart in the first place. And like I said, you could sneak in here. You could just remove the 4 screws on the top plate and just take the top of the diff off, the diff cover off, to get access to the diff and do this a little bit faster. But I wanted to do it the long way in this case. If I had to do a repair, I would probably sneak it out, which is definitely possible with this model. And like I said, super high speed, just putting it back together, just to give you an idea of what it is. But if you do have any specific questions about taking it apart or reassembling it, or need more details, don't hesitate to leave a comment below and ask the question, and I'll be more than happy to help out. But I just thought I would make the video a little shorter. So thanks for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe. See ya, YouTube.